Let's talk more about election season and these political party manifestos, many going to be launched, as Junior was just detailing, over the coming weeks. Bring in political analyst Sanusha Naidu. Sanusha, very good evening to you. So you have been following many political party manifesto launch over the years. In Junior's report, some of the South Africans he spoke to, and I'm not talking to the party faithful here, but ordinary South Africans who these parties will be trying to court, increasingly, it appears, feel as though it's a laundry list of promises that the parties either can't or will not keep. How worrying is that when you look at the fact that this is in the third decade of South Africa's democracy, 30 years on, and people are already beginning to lose hope?
Good evening to Michele. Good evening to the viewers. I think it's really important that election manifestos are there to not just become a laundry list, as you say. It becomes repetitive over the years. You can actually pick out in certain of the election manifestos, whether it's a national election or local government election, how some of the issues get repackaged in the same way. So all around the issues with regard to core questions around the socioeconomic rights of people, access to social services, service delivery, better improvement in quality of infrastructure, and of course, the land question is fundamental as well. But it becomes repackaged, and things like we want to deal with poverty or alleviate poverty, end hunger, those kinds of things which become very, very broad in a sense. It doesn't really define what the mechanism and the operationalization of how you're going to achieve this. And I think what has happened over the last 3 decades is that there's a fatigue within the electorate about hearing the same thing. The promises that are made, the fact that in municipalities we're seeing serious lack of service delivery, serious derelict of municipality responsibility, where there's a lot that's happening at the local government level where the delivery of what the promises are not really happening in reality. You saw the whole question around the question of housing, the question of access to water, access to electricity. I think today in KZN, massive protest in Verulam on the north of KZN around the lack of service delivery and the non-responsiveness of the municipality. So these become important vectors or benchmarks around which you can't keep repeating the same thing without necessarily saying, this is what we're going to do. So I think you've got to be realistic as an election in an election year as a political party, and even if you want to reconstitute some of these services or interests that you think are going to serve the electorate and win you votes at the poll, you have to be careful because you have to be held accountable to it. And I think this is where it's becoming increasingly tense between the electorate and the social contract that they have with the state or with political parties.
Right. And how I wonder about the originality of some of the promises, because everyone talks about the creation of jobs, creation of housing, and some of the language has changed among the political parties. I think you and I will recall when it was a talk about creating jobs, creating housing or building houses, but now for some of the parties, it's now moved to the creation of job opportunities, housing opportunities, whatever that means. But is anyone coming forward with anything that is original as far as how they would deliver on that in a way that speaks to the context of this country?
Well, it's difficult to say because the ruling party would actually say, well, we are in power, we actually create the opportunities, this is what we've done. And they'll use the statistics like we've seen the president do in the January 8th statement to see how much they've created over the last 3 decades. But I think what's really important is to understand that job opportunities is not giving somebody a job. Creating an opportunity to get a house is not necessarily giving them a house. And I think these are the dynamics of what the structural conditions in the economy are, what the structural conditions of the demand, because that's what it's really about. It's about the demand and supply of what you are promising. And if you're making major promises of job opportunities and housing opportunities and other kinds of issues that will deal with the water crisis, will deal with the infrastructure crisis, will actually make sure that there's better services provided. I mean, it's also important to bear bear in mind that most of these municipalities, or at the level in which you're making these promises, it's actually not within your control. There are circumstances that will be beyond your control. For example, the trash won't get picked up because the service contractor or the contractor that you basically subcontracted to do it just didn't turn up to pick up the trash, and the trash begins to become critical in terms of creating all kinds of health hazards, or the fire that these derelict buildings are becoming susceptible to. So there's a very important link here, and a very delicate link, that you've got to be careful about the promises you make. And I think what's becoming increasingly evident now is that the electorate is not sitting back and saying, yeah, we're going to give you our vote because we think you're going to deliver. The problem here is that the delivery has become so dysfunctional in many municipalities in terms of why do people vote and what's the purpose of voting, is that people are saying, well, why should we give you the vote if these services that you can't provide on, you're coming back and you're making promises if you're even changing the language? And I think that's critical in understanding that there's a very astute electorate out there in terms of how they feel that their lives have not been improved from a qualitative perspective.
So what then is the best approach? And I'm asking this in the context of the fact that this year we're expecting to see a lot more as far as choice when it comes to political parties. We've seen some have already come forward and basically let us know what it is that they want to stand for. But in the crafting of their manifestos, what is the best approach to take? Is a shorter manifesto better? And by that I mean one where you make fewer commitments, let's say maybe top 5 issues, top 3 perhaps, that you'd wish to be your main focus. Would that work best?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for political parties is what they're doing in terms of they're contesting at the national level and contesting at the provincial level. And so their manifestos have to be reflective of where they're contesting this election. And because this is going to be a very, very complex election with a number of political actors in the spectrum, it's going to be much more complicated in terms of what you're going to deliver on. So even if you go shorter, you've got to be clear, and you've got to be also very, very you've got to know your assessment of what you're going to win at the polls. Because I think if you know that you want to go national, but you're not going to be able to deliver all of these promises you made, then you need to be much more circumspect, be much more kind of realistic about what you're going to achieve in terms of votes, what you're going to achieve in terms of whether you're going to go into the National Assembly with 1 seat or 2 seats, and whether or not you're going to shift the policy needle on key issues that you promised on. So I think that's the big challenge, is that they're going into an election trying to basically spearhead all of this and make promises, but really not understanding the complexity of an election environment that is really, really a contested environment where the votes are much more shorter now. It's much more the contestation is much more embedded and deeper than before. So if you're going to make promises, you basically are making promises. Are you being genuine in what you are doing? Are you saying that this is what's going to happen? So I think you'd rather just be very clear and say, we're contesting at the national. If we don't win, we're contesting in the province. But this kind of broad and massive multi-party democracy that we have is also very complicated, because you make promises you can't keep, because your power at the polls is actually diminished based on what you get at the end of the day in terms of the result.
Does it not come back to what some have said in the past, where they say there's no such thing as an honest politician, hence the many broken promises?
Well, I think this is the nature of the game that people play in terms of electoral democracy. It's about promises. It's about the kind of relationship you want to have. It's also about going out and challenging the ruling party, challenging others to say, well, we can do things differently. At the end of the day, the power of the electoral democracy is determined by the votes. And the kind of electoral system we have is very difficult in terms of trying to effect the change that you're going to make, in terms of coming together around the question around how you're going to change the constitution in terms of the land redistribution question. How are you going to basically ensure that there's a better informed policy that actually happens around service delivery? So I think it's not so much about, the point about whether it's an honest political party or an honest politician. It's really about being realistic about your own performance at the polls.
Sanusha Naidu, always a pleasure to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. Sanusha is a political analyst joining us on News at Prime as we